Welcome to The Conspiracy Show. My name is Richard Syrett. Princess Diana of Wales, perhaps the most beloved member of the British royal family. She captivated the world with her beauty and her charitable works on behalf of children's hospitals and her campaign to ban landmines. But for many, her tragic death, along with boyfriend Dodi El-Fayed in August of 1997, remains a mystery, perhaps even a conspiracy. Were Diana, the people's princess, and Dodi El-Fayed the victims of a mere car accident? Or was there something more sinister at play? Tonight, we'll meet an investigative journalist who believes that Lady Diana and Dodi El-Fayed were in fact targeted for assassination. I'll speak with a retired detective from Scotland Yard who continues to investigate the deaths of Diana and Dodi El-Fayed on behalf of his former boss, Mohammed El-Fayed. And a London-based television producer and author and widely recognized expert on the Paris crash who contends that Diana and Dodi's deaths were the result of an avoidable accident, a deadly combination of speed, booze, and a series of bad decisions. Me? I just want the truth, and I'm willing to follow it wherever it may lead. It is time to redefine reality. Genetic enigma or a human-alien hybrid? That's how cynical I am about the process. Is it possible technology can alter weather patterns created by the make it? It has been engineered by the Illuminati. Jeffrey Steinberg is the Foreign Intelligence Director with Executive Intelligence Review. Jeffrey, welcome to The Conspiracy Show.
Thank you.
Jeffrey, give me a timeline from the moment that Lady Diana, Dodi El-Fayed, left the Ritz-Carlton and headed towards the tunnel, and then the eventual accident.
They decided, against the advice of Mohammed El-Fayed, to basically make a run for it out the back exit of the hotel because there were large number of paparazzi and some other unknown suspected MI6 people waiting in the crowds outside the front of the hotel. And what you had was a high-speed chase that ended in the crash in the tunnel.
One of the contentious issues has to do with the driver, Henri Paul, and his blood alcohol level. He was described in the British tabloids, even before the autopsy, as being drunk as a pig. Rather odd for them to make that assumption. Was Henri Paul a drunkard?
No.
What about Henri Paul's drinking? Was he in fact an alcoholic?
No. The allegation that Henri Paul was 3 times over the drink-drive limit was made before his body samples had even been analysed. This was pathetic. It was a botched post-mortem, if you like. We then asked for an independent post-mortem examination, which in any other country you would have, and that was bluntly refused by the French.
The same blood test that claimed to show that his alcohol levels were 3 times the maximum allowed showed a near-lethal dose of carbon monoxide in his blood.
It wasn't until they published findings of carbon monoxide in Henri Paul's blood that we got further scientists involved in this. And they said if Henri Paul had had that amount of carbon monoxide in his blood, he wouldn't be able to stand, let alone drive a car.
He would have been unable to stand up. He would have been in excruciating pain. He would have been dizzy. He would have been incapable of walking on his own. If you're going to claim that that blood sample shows that he was drunk, then you have to say that the same blood sample shows that he was near death from carbon monoxide poisoning and could not have even made his way to the car.
I mean, why would Henri Paul have such a high carbon monoxide reading in his blood? But more concerning is that there was found in his blood samples a medicine given to people who had tapeworm, which would be consistent with the fact that they'd been muddled up with a tramp.
A drunk who fell asleep above one of the subway grids in Paris. Somebody who had basically died of carbon monoxide poisoning. So whether it was by accident or by intent. There's very good reason to say that that blood sample was not of Henri Paul, or if it was of Henri Paul, it was badly doctored.
What about the reports, eyewitness reports, of a flash of light in the tunnel, perhaps some sort of handheld laser device used to blind the driver, Henri Paul?
The reports of that are highly credible.
Numerous eyewitnesses say there was a flash in the tunnel. There is no doubt about that. And there was certainly a white Uno in the tunnel.
Now, there were eyewitnesses along the route, including an off-duty French police officer who spotted the white Fiat, the infamous missing white Fiat.
There were a number of witnesses at the time who were not interviewed by the French police.
They'd been interviewed by newspapers, and their statements had been published by newspapers, but they were never routinely interviewed. So the original investigation was never done properly in Paris, in my opinion.
Well, the inquest for Dodi and Diana was comprehensive. It was reported towards the end of the inquest that more words had been spoken at the inquest than are written in the Holy Bible. There were hundreds of witnesses, and it went on for nearly 6 months.
But half those witnesses were never called to the inquest here. Half them were never, their evidence, some of them hadn't even been interviewed.
What we do know from the inquest verdict was that Diana perished as a result of a drunken driver driving too fast while being pursued by the paparazzi.
No, I don't think it was. I certainly don't think it was. I really don't think it was an adequate inquiry.
And again, the role of the mysterious white Fiat Uno in the tunnel was to do what?
The Fiat was at the entrance to the tunnel, and with the Mercedes driving at about 55 miles an hour, all you would have to do is sort of nick it at an angle.
Only a glancing blow, but enough to drive the Mercedes completely off course and to collide with the 13th pillar in the armored tunnel.
There is zero evidence to suggest it forced the Mercedes anywhere.
The Fiat sped off out of the tunnel, disappeared from the face of the earth. There was strong evidence that surfaced after the crash, largely through the diligent efforts of the private investigation financed by Mohammed Al-Fayed.
The white Fiat Uno was eventually identified, in fact, by us rather than the French police.
We know that from forensic tests that were done by the French.
It was driven by a man named James Anderson.
A chap called Owned-enquiries, a French photographer.
Was he connected with MI5 or MI6?
There are a lot of indications that would suggest that.
He pursued Dodi and Diana throughout the Mediterranean. He was obsessed with them.
He travelled all over the place, and indeed he had, we believe, photographed Diana and Dodi at one stage in the south of France, and he was keen on them.
Anderson, we believe, was driving that white Fiat Uno. He also had links to the security services.
Now, he was interviewed by the French police, and yes, he did have a white Fiat Uno. This was a fact, and they found it. The white Fiat was found. However, there was a problem. It was on bricks. It hadn't been anywhere for about a year.
Anderson was found in the south of France in a remote area in his car, which was burnt out. They said that it was suicide.
When he topped himself, this led to all sorts of conspiracy theories that he was done away by the intelligence service. They had to get rid of him. He was in the tunnel. He's the key to the whole thing. Well, it's all complete nonsense.
Anyway, it was always accepted by the French and the inquest that this was a suicide.
The same day that he was being found dead, there was a break-in to the photographic service that he worked for. It was a very professional break-in, probably done by British or French police. The relationships are complex, but they're very, very deep between the paparazzi and the police and intelligence services.
But are you suggesting that Anderson, at the wheel of this white Fiat Uno, was then responsible for causing the car crash? Therefore, Anderson was, in effect, the assassin?
It may very well be the case.
There are reports I believe first reported in EIR by yourself,
Right.
that there was a physician who happened on the scene, discovered Lady Diana in the back of the Mercedes,
Right.
quite conscious, quite alert. What more can you tell me?
The emergency doctor immediately diagnosed her as suffering from internal bleeding. When you believe that you've got someone still alive who's bleeding internally, I don't care if you're in Paris, France, or on the moon, there's only one thing you do. And you scoop them up and you get them into surgery as fast as possible. You cut them open and you find out where the bleeding is and you stop it.
It took them about an hour to get to the hospital.
Yeah, well, they didn't leave the scene, I don't think, for an hour while they treated her, and then it took almost an hour again to get to the hospital. They went past one hospital that some people believe could have treated her.
Well, they had to take her to the hospital that had the facilities to deal with a crash victim in her situation. And the other reason they stopped was because she had a heart attack as they were going to the hospital. And so therefore they had to save her life.
The explanation that I've been given was that in France they do things a little differently. And when it was required to perform some delicate procedure, perhaps to stabilize Lady Di, they actually pulled over to perform that procedure. Does that make sense to you?
Not at all. Number one, there was a military hospital with the best trauma facility in the city, much closer to the scene of the crash than the hospital that she was brought to. She should have been immediately medevaced into that hospital. She could have been in surgery within 15 minutes after the first emergency people arriving.
The ambulance attendant reportedly testified that the ambulance was ordered to slow down and at one point stop in order to perform some delicate procedure on Diana. What can you tell me about that? It sounds rather strange.
Well, they say it was... There are some very, very extreme rumours about that, actually. The doubters say that that might have been a very good opportunity to give her an abortion, and that she might have actually arrived at the hospital already having had an abortion.
Was Diana pregnant? Answer, no. How do we know she wasn't pregnant? We know from her autopsy, which was conducted less than 24 hours after her passing, that she was not pregnant.
There are some question marks over how that autopsy was conducted and whether, yet again, things were done in a not absolutely correct way.
The fact that she was embalmed before leaving Paris, is that not highly irregular?
No. The explanation given, which I personally can believe easily, was that the French wanted to make her body look respectable when her sister and her husband, Prince Charles, or former husband, came to visit her. So it was done for presentational purposes. It was not fully embalmed, it was partially embalmed, so the corpse itself looked reasonable for this very sensitive visit.
There were certainly people there who were members of the royal household, and there may well have been pressure being put on, you see, already, to produce a picture of events that wasn't entirely accurate.
Is it probable that she was pregnant?
I think Diana might have been tipped into doing anything to annoy the royal family at that stage. And I do think she was in love with Dodi, yes.
Mr. Alfie is quite adamant about all of this. He had lengthy conversations with Dodi and Diana whilst they were at the Ritz. They had champagne on ice, the butler was standing by. Dodi had an engagement ring there that he intended to give to Diana.
And she said about the ring, well, he's going to give me a ring of some sort, but it's going on the fourth finger of my right hand, i.e. I am not going to marry Dodi Fayed.
Yet there is an engagement ring sitting in Harrods. What is that?
The engagement ring, the ring is called an engagement ring. A few things you need to know about that. One is that Dodi himself did not select it. Secondly, Diana never saw it. And thirdly, Mohammed Fayed bought it after they were dead. Now, if that makes an engagement ring to you, maybe it doesn't make one to me. I mean, that's a complete myth.
She gave him, significantly, her father's cufflinks and wrote him a note, which has been published since, saying, these are my dearest possession, or words to this effect. These are more important to me than anything else, and therefore I want to give them to you. Well, you would hardly do that to a man you didn't love.
I dismissed that. Not that I know whether or not she was pregnant or not, but my view is that one of the aspects of the cover-up here was to turn it into soap opera.
Kensington Palace, the former residence of the late Lady Diana, Princess of Wales. We're here to investigate whether she was the victim of a car crash or perhaps murder most foul.
The plan was for Diana to have an accident. We want to break up this relationship with this boyfriend. We want to make Diana look foolish. We want to give her a warning. Those were the words I was to. We want to give her a warning. You know, a broken arm, that kind of thing. And that all went horribly wrong.
What we're really dealing with here is classic high British politics. She basically tore the Windsors apart. She talked about her former husband, her in-laws, and she basically painted a picture of a dysfunctional family that had no qualifications to be on the English throne.
I think that Diana was very angry at the time. She'd had her HRH title removed.
I mean, absolutely disgraceful. They said, oh, she's no longer a member of the royal family, that's it. I mean, that was just real bitchiness on behalf of the royal family. And I suspected the person responsible was Prince Philip. That chap, who's an absolute disgrace to manhood.
Prince Philip made it known that he was out to get her. And it's not the kind of thing where Prince Philip had to even come out and call in the head of MI6 and say, I want her whacked.
Let's talk about the letter in which Diana confessed that she was frightened that her brakes were going to be fixed. What do you make of that letter?
Previously, she'd had reliable information, according to her, that her husband was planning to have her killed in a staged car accident.
Something must be done. And before you know it, an operation is structured to take care of it and to make it appear an accident. She, in fact, told one of her friends in a letter a year or so beforehand that she was sure that her in-laws were going to have her killed and it would likely be tampering with her car.
And her fears were such that she summoned her lawyer, Lord Mishcon, to Kensington Palace, just around the corner here, and she told him exactly what she believed would happen, what she'd been told would happen. In fact, what did in fact happen eventually, that she would be killed in a staged car accident.
On her last journey, Diana left from a fired hotel, travelling towards a fired apartment. She was travelling in a fired car, being driven by a fired driver.
The official inquiry into the deaths of Princess Diana and Dodi Fayed concluded that the pair were killed as a result of the grossly negligent driving of chauffeur Henri Paul and the reckless pursuit of the paparazzi. But for me, many questions remain. Why did Henri Paul's behavior prior to the accident significantly differ from the published intoxication results? And why was that legal document proving Princess Diana feared there was a plot to kill her in a car crash kept secret for 6 years by Britain's most senior police officers? According to MI5 agent David Shaler, vehicle accidents are used as a method of assassination precisely because they're such a common cause of death. It's easier for authorities to claim that anyone crying foul is simply a conspiracy theorist. In this case, I think it's quite possible that someone within British intelligence, possibly acting with the tacit approval of a member of the royal family, caused the accident to merely scare the princess, to send a message. The plot then turned out to be far more successful than previously intended. And now, I'd like to know what you think. You can contact us here at The Conspiracy Show through our website, www.theconspiracyshow.com. Welcome to The Conspiracy Show. I'm Richard Syrett. Monday, December 8th, 1980. I was at a friend's house. We were watching Monday Night Football, but we had the sound on the TV turned down because we were listening to records. We'd only recently discovered the Beatles. So I went home that night not knowing that Howard Cosell had just announced to the world that John Lennon had been shot and killed outside his New York apartment. The world was told Lennon was murdered by a crazed fan looking for attention, and many of us believed that version of events. For me and millions, Lennon's death meant the end of a selfish dream. Now the Beatles could never reform. Of course, Yoko Ono had lost a devoted husband, and Sean and Julian had lost a father. It was only years later I also came to appreciate Lennon's other contribution, lending his voice to civil rights, peace, and equality. On this episode of The Conspiracy Show, we'll meet investigators and researchers who conclude Lennon was targeted for assassination because his commitment to nonviolence and peace made him a very, very dangerous person. We're about to find out who may have wanted him dead and how they did it. We'll also hear evidence to suggest Mark David Chapman was anything but a crazed and delusional fan seeking attention, but rather another in a long line of programmed assassins, a Manchurian candidate. And of course, our skeptic will weigh in and strongly suggest that Lennon's tragic death was merely a result of celebrity meets bad man with gun. Me? Just give me some truth. I'll follow it wherever it leads. It is time to redefine reality. Genetic enigma or a human alien hybrid? That's how cynical I am now about the process. Mainstream media, they've thrown in the towel. Alter weather patterns created by the corporation. Engineered by the Illuminati.
John Lennon was murdered because he decided to become a whistleblower. The music was really written by Lennon, but then it was completely mastered and changed by computers at Tavistock, so that like Muzak, which has a desired effect to get you to shop in the stores, this gives you a desired effect to want to involve in and take drugs.
According to Nelson Thal and his mentor, the late Marshall McLuhan, the Beatles were created as a psychological warfare weapon at the Tavistock Institute in London, England. Tavistock has long been known as the precursor of the infamous CIA MK-Ultra mind control program. What was the purpose then of the Beatles in America?
What was happening at that time in 1964 was the Warren Commission inquiry was about to come out. America's attention was on a coup d'etat and the murder of the president. It was very important to kickstart the American consciousness away from understanding and learning about what really happened in Dallas. The British invasion, as we call it, was brought in to distract America's mind away from the Kennedy assassination report and to bring in the drugs, weapons of mass control, so you can stop thought, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds.
There are many people who look at LSD in America and think that LSD was primarily an American invention. They have this sort of colloquial belief that everything is somehow an American invention. But it was really the British that brought LSD to the United States. There seems to have been a reason behind this tremendous attention that America was being given by the British, whether it was the Beatles or other British invasion type bands. And the focus of the music, whether it started that way or not, was really towards the psychedelic. So in a sense, the Beatles themselves were, again, just a small fragment of what might have been a much larger entity.
One of the things that came out of that was the whole psychedelic movement, the infusion of LSD, which the CIA was a major player in. The nation had just suffered this psychic trauma with the Kennedy assassination and the British invasion. The Beatles came in, they were on Ed Sullivan. I remember seeing that there was like a positive feeling throughout the country, hope and promise that perhaps things were going to be better or moving in a new and positive direction with this British invasion.
Just as the Beatles were at the pinnacle of their success, tragedy struck. On August 27, 1967, their longtime manager, Brian Epstein, was found dead in London of an apparent accidental overdose. However, media scientist Nelson Thal is convinced Epstein's death was no accident.
Well, he was suicided. His ability to manipulate them had come to an end, and so he knew too much and he had to be taken out of the way.
Why did McCartney suddenly take off for Scotland and John Lennon took off for Amsterdam as if they were running for their lives?
Yeah, I think they really were running for their lives. I think that they also realized at that time that if this was something that they were involved with that had this kind of level of danger, that they were responding to it in the only way that they knew how. And so they basically just pulled up stakes and left.
In December of 1969, John and Yoko visited Toronto as part of their peace campaign. During their visit, Lennon traveled to the University of Toronto, where he met with Canadian philosopher of communications theory, Marshall McLuhan. McLuhan's work is viewed as one of the cornerstones of the study of media theory, but Marshall McLuhan also believed in conspiracies.
What Lennon's meeting with McLuhan may have precipitated was the next step that Lennon took. Marshall McLuhan, who was basically the Don of the intelligentsia at the University of Toronto, would hold court in the coach house. John Lennon walks in, and apparently he says to John Lennon, "Do you know you're a useful fool?"
Marshall McLuhan, of course, told John Lennon that he had been a student and involved backstage in the secret societies. McLuhan pointed out that the arts and sciences were in the pockets of the secret societies.
How was McLuhan's message to Lennon received by Lennon?
Lennon left the meeting in a huff and a puff and refused to believe it. Of course, he came back a few days later with his tail between his legs and realized that McLuhan had put together the dots in his life and shown him a pattern that he hadn't previously seen, and now he was pretty upset as to how he had been abused.
Yeah, it seems like after that meeting with McLuhan, the musical direction changed with Lennon. The focus of his music shifted and he became much more politically active.
Of all the conspiracy theories that revolve around people faking their death or people being killed by the government, stars, I'm thinking, Elvis, Marilyn Monroe, John Lennon, all those stories, John Lennon's has the most probability to it. He was clearly someone of influence to an enormous population that the government at the time didn't really understand. From the point at which he moved to the United States, and even before, the Beatles had such a huge influence over the youth of America that I can see why government might have been interested in having a closer look at what he was preaching to them, the influences of his music, the drug culture that he seemed to be promoting, all that stuff. I get all that. But let's face it, in terms of the effect that it had on the people that he was playing to, that were buying his records, I don't see it. People grew their hair long. People, maybe smoked an extra joint on a Friday night after listening to the Beatles. Certainly, I'm not trying to downplay the influence of them, but they weren't a force for, radical things. Charles Manson notwithstanding.
He was surrounded at all times by the intelligence agencies. I don't know that he was able to discern who was who, but I'm sure he felt that the British were very much involved.
He was definitely being watched, and was not only being watched, but the people who were watching him guarded him as well.
During that period, Lennon claimed that he was under surveillance. He felt like his wires were tapped. Some people said, you're being paranoid about this.
He knew his phones were being wiretapped. He said he couldn't understand why the phones in New York City were not working because there were always guys in fixing the phones. His life in New York was very, very uncomfortable.
Lennon's supposed killer, Mark David Chapman, was immediately portrayed by the New York City police and the media as mentally imbalanced, an obsessed fan who became disillusioned with the former Beatle. In his book, God Code Peace, author Pepper Chomsky pieces together an entirely different picture of Chapman.
We know that Mark David Chapman was very, very involved with the drug culture.
During the 70s, Mark David Chapman was employed by the YMCA. The YMCA, in many cases, it's been shown, has worked as a front operation for the CIA.
Okay, well, history tells us that Mark David Chapman went to Beirut, and it was part of a YMCA program.
The YMCA sent Chapman all around the world, to Vietnam, for instance, and Beirut, where he received training as a security guard.
Is the suggestion here that he wasn't really at the YMCA camp? He was being brainwashed, perhaps programmed to be an assassin?
You know, Mark David Chapman was not staying in a hostel in downtown Beirut, and Shamlan was considered as a spy school for the British.
So there's this specter of spookiness around Mark David Chapman.
Mark David Chapman made no attempt to escape. His mission, his crusade, his attitude, his mental attitude was such that he was very satisfied with the job that he did. He had no interest in escaping.
Arthur O'Connor was the lieutenant with the New York Police Department's 20th Precinct. They were the ones that were conducting the investigation into Lennon's murder. Let me read you a quote, and he was interviewed by British author Fenton Bresler. Arthur O'Connor said, "As far as you are trying to build up some kind of a conspiracy, I would support you in that line. Like I said originally over the phone, if this gentleman Chapman wanted to get away with it, he could have walked away." Again, he sat down, he started reading from Catcher in the Rye, waiting to be apprehended.
He could have walked away. I mean, you would think that, you know, I think virtually anybody that picks up a gun and shoots people has some form of mental illness somewhere. I mean, it's not a rational thing to do. I don't think he was thinking beyond, after firing the gun, what was going to happen.
The people who saw him were all leading experts. The psychiatrists who were involved with Mark David Chapman, they were completely baffled by him.
Classic mind control, just like a Manchurian candidate that was sent to assassinate Reagan. It came out of the same group, ruling elite assassination teams that killed Lennon.
But the idea that Chapman was a Manchurian candidate, I think, is bunk. I just don't buy it. I've read a lot of the conspiracy theory material that goes along with it, and it just doesn't have a ring of truth to me.
Well, we do know that the CIA has admitted on the record that they did conduct experiments into mind control. We have Project Artichoke, we have MK Ultra, we have psychologists, people like Michael Klein from New York, who say it is possible to hypnotize and brainwash someone to do something they wouldn't ordinarily do, like kill someone.
No, it's possible. It's possible. I mean, I think that you have to have what hypnotists, the amazing Ravine and people, stage hypnotists, always say, I can't make you do anything that you wouldn't do normally. And, you know, Chapman doesn't strike me as that guy.
The attempted assassination on Ronald Reagan was perpetrated by John Hinckley. They later found in John Hinckley's possession the book The Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger. Now, when Mark David Chapman was apprehended, leaning up against the Dakota building, reading The Catcher in the Rye, and what this suggested to me was that the Catcher in the Rye was used as a mechanism of control, basically to trigger a post-hypnotic command.
Many of the Manchurian candidates have post-hypnotic suggestions to trigger them to go into the act. Catcher in the Rye has historically been used by the British intelligence in Tavistock as a post-hypnotic, in the 50s and 60s it was, early on, the post-hypnotic suggestion, the trigger to get them to go into action.
You have a deeply troubled person, and, you know, ultimately, I think that he was someone who felt that he was a nobody and wanted to become somebody, and he chose a despicable, tragic route to becoming that person. Someone who chose a tragic, horrible way to assert themselves in a world where they feel like they have no control.
When Mark David Chapman was arrested and he was first offered legal defense, his plea was not guilty. And then he decided he heard the voice of God, and he changed his plea to guilty. Within a moment, any opportunity that one might have had to investigate the murder of John Lennon disappears.
Here's what John's son, John Lennon, said about his dad's assassination in 1998. He was a countercultural revolutionary, and the government takes that shit really seriously. He was dangerous to the government. These pacifist revolutionaries are historically killed by the government, and anybody who thinks Mark David Chapman was just some crazy guy who killed my dad for his personal interests is insane, or hasn't thought about it clearly.
Pacifist revolutionary, I think, stretches the credulity a little bit, in the sense that, the bed-ins for peace, I'm not sure how much real effect any of that had. And I think John Lennon, probably, with his 300-page dossier put together by the FBI in working with the CIA, I don't think that was enough for them to go, we're going to pluck someone out of obscurity. We're going to find the 1 in 1 million person that we can hypnotize and make them do something that they would never normally do. We're going to find that person. We're going to look all across the United States. Okay, we found that guy in Hawaii. We had to look really far, but we found that guy in Hawaii. We're going to take him underground. We're going to train him. We're going to hypnotize him. We're going to send him to New York. We're going to get him to kill a Beatle for us. To me, it stretches the limits of, I think, what is reasonable. I think that you have a deeply disturbed guy working by himself, who, probably, I would imagine, loves the idea that people think that he was a government operative.
So is the Tavistock Institute or other intelligence groups still involved in this game of co-opting rock groups and co-opting their music for these nefarious purposes of mind control?
The music now is just a tribal drum beat, and it's not necessary to deceive the masses and rule the masses with the suggestive music. Now they just use the invisible powers of the air through the cell phones.
Lennon told Paul Krasner, the editor of The Realist, if something happens to me, it wasn't an accident. Years later, all these FBI documents came out showing that Lennon had been surveilled by the Nixon administration, and their pretext was a marijuana bust, but the real intent behind that was because he was an anti-war advocate. And there was this fear of the rock stars during that period had a lot of influence, and especially afraid about the ones who could bring masses of people together, much like Woodstock at a moment's notice.
British intelligence had very, very similar files that the FBI had on John Lennon. And so one would suspect that they were working together, and that the information that was being supplied to the FBI and the information that was being supplied to British intelligence was being handed back and forth fairly openly.
We know the CIA and FBI constantly surveil John Lennon. He was considered a subversive and a radical. We know the CIA takes subversives very seriously. Today, we know the president has the power to order U.S. citizens to be assassinated without due process. And we know the FBI had a 300-page file on Lennon. Much of it remains classified for national security reasons. The doorman at the Dakota that night was Jose Perdomo, a veteran of the CIA's botched Bay of Pigs invasion, a professional hitman who worked closely with convicted Watergate burglar Frank Sturgis on the CIA's payroll. Now, none of this conclusively proves Lennon was assassinated by the CIA or MI6 or that Chapman was a Manchurian candidate. It's never that easy. We have to dig way down, deeper than Anderson Cooper has ever been, deeper where few of us are willing to go. That's where the truth lies, and that's where it will likely stay. Because as Lennon himself penned in Strawberry Fields Forever, living is easy with eyes closed. And now, I'd like to know what you think. Get in touch with me through the website, theconspiracyshow.com. In the meantime, don't be afraid. Welcome to The Conspiracy Show. My name is Richard Syrett. He was arguably the most charismatic and enigmatic frontman in the history of rock. James Douglas Morrison, the lead singer of the 60s psychedelic band The Doors, was found dead in a bathtub in Paris in July 1971. But his supposed death at the age of 27 only intensified his legend and mystique. On this episode of The Conspiracy Show, we investigate claims that Jim Morrison did not die in Paris in 1971. In fact, we're about to meet several rock investigators who believe there are too many inconsistencies and mysteries in the official version of events. Not everyone is convinced Morrison's tomb in Père Lachaise Cemetery in Paris is empty. We'll hear from a skeptic who will affirm, as Morrison himself wrote, "Nobody here gets out alive." Me? I just want the truth, and I'm willing to follow it wherever it leads. It is time to redefine reality. Genetic enigma or a human alien hybrid? That's how cynical I am now about the process. Mainstream media, technology, and alter weather patterns created by the corporation has been engineered by the Illuminati.
There's no doubt.
In 1966, I met Ann Morrison. I married her, and it turns out she was the sister of Jim Morrison, the famous Doors. However, at that time, we didn't know it because he disappeared after graduating from UCLA. About 6 months after our marriage, we got a package in the mail from the United States. We opened it up, and there was an album cover, and it had a picture of Jim Morrison on it. And I had no idea. I came home from work, and my wife was sitting on the floor crying with all our friends around. There was this weird Bach, organ music, death, funeral music playing. It was intense, but they were all crying. I went, "Oh my God, someone's dead here." She said, "Do you know who this is?" And I said, "No." And she said, "This is my brother." And I went, and it was intense because we started listening to the quality of music, and it was not lightweight. It was beautiful. Blues and rock and roll and rhythm and blues, but classical too, poetry and Bach and Shakespeare and everyone in this beautiful, beautiful first album, The Doors. He graduated from UCLA with a degree in cinema and fine arts, and wrote to his father and said, "Dad, I found this band and I want to become a musician." And his dad flipped and said, "Okay, that's it, cut off, no matter what. And by the way, draft board, go sign up because you're now no longer a student. And until you do exactly what we need, you're cut off." So they cut him off, and he didn't run away.
You know, he told his record label that his parents were dead, and then his mother and sister show up for one of his shows. I know that his father and Jim had issues because his father was the youngest admiral, and he never got another promotion because the Doors were so big in the counterculture, and that his father had actually tried to have agents go find Jim because Jim refused to go into the draft and refused to serve his country. So that was a barrier between them. A lot of people think that, who are close, thought that maybe his father was relieved when Jim died.
That's what the Admiral wanted. And so that's what Jim was running from, that resentment. He never spoke to them ever again. If you brought up your daddy, come up, or he would just freeze you out. No one could talk to him about his parents. For him, the Admiral said, you're wasting all this on Hollywood crap, and you could be anything. Yeah, he could have been. In fact, when he graduated from UCLA, IBM, CIA, FBI, and all the headhunters approached him and I think 8 others because he was classified what they call gifted student status. And big companies want those kids, you know, all of them. So he could have been anything. So, which leads me to what he could have been and what he might have been and what he still may be for all we know.
So he died in his hotel room in the bathtub, apparent heart attack there, and his wife discovered him, common wife Pamela Corson, brought in a doctor, and supposedly those were the only 2 people who saw him after he died. The doctor signed the death certificate that was a heart attack. There was no autopsy performed afterwards, which once again was kind of odd. An American in France, that young of an age, it was customary, I've been told, that he should have had an autopsy.
There was no autopsy? Can you imagine somebody so famous? There was no investigation? Why not? Because she didn't follow up. She didn't go to the authorities, the American authorities, and say, this is Jim Morrison, his father is Admiral Morrison, and he died.
Pamela Corson, who did see the body, tried to convince the medical examiner that Morrison had died from congestive heart failure brought on by this terrible cough.
She did the reverse opposite, the polar opposite of that behavior. Everything to cover up his death. Why?
She was able to sell the story. Now, she didn't tell the family.
And then they had the funeral. None of the family, immediate family, was invited. None of the Doors band member. There was 5 people there at that funeral. It's kind of murky who those 5 people were.
I know that Ray Manzarek had sent the Doors manager, Bill Siddons, to Paris to check on the body, and when he left, Ray looked at him and said, make sure. He said, I don't want to sound ghoulish, but make sure. So when Bill got to Paris, he saw a simple wood veneer coffin with a coffin lid screwed into place. He didn't see the body.
There's no question, I think, that he's dead. The question is sort of more how and where and when did he die?
Richard, you mentioned after Morrison died, there was no autopsy. Now, I'm not even sure that's legal given the circumstances surrounding his death. But on the death certificate, it mentioned, or it listed the cause of death as heart failure. That's a little like saying Ernest Hemingway died of a trauma to the brain. Very vague.
The conspiracy here is very possibly just one of protecting rich drug dealers, more so than anything else. And I think that probably the doctor came in and said, okay, what's the thing that we don't really have to examine much more? You know what? Heart failure. Everyone will believe that.
Just so much wrong information about his death that now, and with Oliver Stone's, cartoon version of what Jim's life was, there's no reality in who he really was and what happened to him.
Everyone knows that he drank, that he smoked, that he did recreational drugs. People would buy heart failure. And, if we bury him fast enough, that'll be, we'll get away with this.
After doing heroin all night with his girlfriend, total lie. He got into the bathtub. And her story unravels to me badly because the truth was she was hanging with the local heroin addicts, Agnes Varda, Marianne Faithfull, and the Count, who was a heroin supplier. All of that whole culture was Marseille heroin, real heroin, not the American 50%. This was almost pure. So Pamela was very much into that. And a drunk is a drunk. That's his poison, this evil pall of junkies, sweating, white, sickness. That wasn't Jim.
You looked at the death scene photos. Did it look like Jim in the bathtub?
Couldn't tell. Big beard, big hair, eyes closed. Could have been.
If you talk to Alan Graham's got an interesting story. Of course, Alan was Jim's brother-in-law, and he talks about a German citizen that resembled Jim so completely. He said, I saw a photograph, I couldn't tell them apart.
Could that have been the guy Pamela found when she came home and just freaked and didn't look close enough? When she was also on junk and going there?
What if Dietmar, the German immigrant or the German individual, passed away and his body was buried? It would allow Jim the ultimate opportunity to escape.
This guy would show up in the bar and they'd say, hi, Jim. And it wasn't Jim, it was Dieter. If you knew what we looked like back then, a lot of people had big beards and big hair. They looked like Charlie Manson. And Jim Morrison did look like Rasputin. I'm saying, who saw him? And what state were they in when they saw him?
Went and he visited the cemetery in France where he was buried a few times. There was a lot of French poets and people he admired, Rimbaud, Baudelaire. And he picked out his gravesite. And that was like 3 days before he ended up dying.
Many people have commented upon visiting the plot, including his former bandmates. I believe it was either John Densmore or Bobby Krieger, who looked at the size of the plot. Now, Jim was about 5'11". and said there's no way they could fit his body in this plot?
You know, I don't have an answer for that. I do know that when people are buried, you know, particularly if, you know, you get the little pine box, if you're not someone of means and you're buried by the state, sometimes, you know, your legs are bent a little bit when you're put in the box. Sometimes, now that's certainly not the case here, but I do know that it's, you know, a few inches discrepancy here and there. You know, I don't know what that's all about.
I'm 6'2", and to be 6 foot tall, you could not be in that space. I think Dinsmore makes that statement in Riders on the Storm when he goes to Perilous Sheds about the grave being short. I know Ray Manzarek stood on the grave and said, this grave's too short. Jim can't be buried here.
10 years after his death, I was doing a rock opera at Gazzari's called Morrison the Rock Opera. And we had 7 Jim Morrisons. We called them the Jimtations. And they were all performing and fighting each other. And it was a kind of interesting little play. And we were all standing out front one day, and this guy walked by. I swear to God, quickly looked back like that, and one of the clones said, "Hey, Jim!" He just thought it was too. And the guy looked back, and for a minute there, you know, it's like, a little older or something. And the guy scurried away. But it was like, did he come by to see what we were doing there? We were doing the revival, and we were trying to delve into his death at that time, what happened to him. And so I've often, people have said, yeah, could it have been Jim? You know, maybe.
Morrison had a very high IQ, and he had told the members of the band that he could see himself retiring from the music business. He wanted to be a poet, or he could go into business, and then he sort of disappeared.
He sat down with Jack Holtzman, who was an record exec at Elektra, and he said, "Jack, what would happen to record sales if I were to suddenly disappear? How would it affect business? Would people believe it?" Sounds like he really gave it careful consideration.
He may have, you know, he may have. People who are high often have kind of odd ideas about things. And, you know, maybe, you know, let's keep in mind the time. Let's keep in time, you know, the place, Los Angeles, late 60s. Let's think about what state of mind he might have been in when all this was happening. He's being worked very hard, harder than he's ever worked before in his life. He's surrounded by people, all of whom want something from him. I think probably the natural inclination that he might have is, I want out of this. I want some kind of break from it. So maybe, you know, he may well have thought about it. He may have thought about it, though, in terms of, you know, what would happen if I took a year off? I wouldn't mind taking some time off. But when you're famous, it's not like having a 9-to-5 job. You don't get to take a week off from being famous. You're still going to be famous no matter sort of what happens. And so I think with Jim Morrison, he may well have fantasized about disappearing, but I have a feeling that maybe in his floral way of speaking, you know, taking a week off became, you know, what if I go away and I pretend I'm dead, man?
Morrison was part of the Laurel Canyon scene, and there's different researchers been looking into that. All the rock stars that came out of Laurel Canyon at the same time, they seem to have these curious backgrounds where their families were involved in military or intelligence work, such as Jim Morrison and his father. It's interesting to note that Morrison's father was the admiral of a battleship involved in the Gulf of Tonkin incident, basically a false flag incident that launched the Vietnam War.
1973, the LA Free Press, a couple of wire services, picked up on a story that someone claiming to be Jim Morrison, looking an awful lot like Jim Morrison, shows up at the Bank of America in San Francisco and conducts business. We even have the name of a bank employee there, Walt Fleischer, who says, I can't confirm 100% it was Jim, but he looked like him. What do you make of that?
Well, what did Jim Morrison look like at that time? I mean, in the few short years that he was famous, he went from this svelte kind of love god kind of looking Adonis almost with his unborn pony skin pants to being a bloated, heavier guy with long hair. So I'd be interested to know what this bank employee thought Jim Morrison would look like in 1973.
Thomas Lytle, he was a conspiracy researcher, and he looked into these rumors of Jim Morrison being alive, particularly between the period of 1972 and 1992. Somebody calling themselves James Douglas Morrison was involved in international banking, international espionage.
The idea that maybe he's out there somewhere and maybe there will be one more great Doors album. And that's, I think, what happened with Elvis. That's what happened with all these sightings that people claim, is that they're just not ready to let go yet.
Thomas Lytle himself died a few years ago, so who can say for sure? Jim Morrison's house here in LA burned down recently. You familiar with that? The house on Love Street. Yeah, there was a serial arsonist working. I started thinking of the song Light My Fire, and perhaps maybe Jim Morrison came back to destroy some evidence. I mentioned that to a friend and they said, well, I don't see it. After all the years of drinking and carry on, he'd be old and decrepit, but now the stories are that he got clean and sober after his supposed death and became this superstar intelligence agent. Maybe indeed he did come back and do that to cover his tracks.
Pamela did not have the money to buy the grave space, so she leased it for 30 years, which was in 2001. Everyone was convinced that Jim was going to be dug up and sent back to LA, and it would be the Jim Morrison's LA tour, but he was kept in Père Lachaise because the Morrison family agreed to clear the graffiti and to pay for security.
The three remaining members of the Doors, God love them, have made a living off keeping the legacy of Jim Morrison alive for a very long time. You know, let's build the legend of this guy who's no longer with us, because it will continue to sell records, it will continue to keep the mythology going, and people seem to like the mythology. We keep selling records, so let's do that.
Ray now says, oh no, he's dead and he's buried there, but in VH1 he also said, when they open that grave on July 8th, 2001, I'm going to be there with Doors fans around the world, and we're going to be saying, open the box, open the box.
Jim Morrison, I think, sounds to me like probably a sensitive guy who liked to write poetry, who was a guy who had a troubled family life, who, when he became famous, self-medicated with drugs and alcohol.
I hope Jim's still alive somewhere. I really do. And it could be. In my romantic heart, I see him as saying, it, and walking away and becoming a different person.
The idea of disappearing was kind of probably a romantic notion for him. I think that's probably what he had in mind when he went to Paris.
And if anyone could have pulled it off, it would be him. Because in a way, he was mercurial and special.
I don't think there's any chance of him actually faking his own death and wanting it, because I think that deep down, Jim Morrison enjoyed being Jim Morrison. He enjoyed the fame and the advantages and the women and everything else that came along with being that famous.
Perhaps the best evidence that Jim didn't die in 1971 is the near total absence of evidence that he did die. Only his wife, Pamela Corson, and the medical examiner that declared him dead were allowed to see the body. But Pam couldn't recall the name of the doctor. There's no police reports, emergency call logs, medical examiner logs, reports or records, and no autopsy was ever performed. And no real funeral to speak of. Jim Morrison was in love with the story of Arthur Rimbaud, a French poet who, at the age of 19, became overwhelmed by his fame, staged his death, and escaped to Africa. Jim told bandmate Robbie Krieger that 20 years after his death to expect a phone call from Mr. Mojo Rison. If Robbie did get a call from Jim back in 1991, I'm sure he would have kept it quiet. Wouldn't you do that for a friend? Now, I'd like to know what you think. You can get in touch with me here at The Conspiracy Show through the website, theconspiracyshow.com. Hello and welcome to The Conspiracy Show. I'm Richard Syrett. In the early morning of August 5th, 1962, Hollywood legend Marilyn Monroe was found dead in her Brentwood, California home by her housekeeper and psychiatrist. The official cause of death was acute barbiturate poisoning. The passage of time, however, has done nothing to diminish her status as America's favorite sex symbol, nor the suspicions and speculations about what really happened that night. On this episode of The Conspiracy Show, we'll examine the mysterious circumstances surrounding the death of screen legend Marilyn Monroe. We're about to hear from several researcher authors who believe Monroe's death was not the result of an accidental overdose or by suicide. They contend Monroe was murdered because she knew too much as a result of her long speculated affairs, first with President John F. Kennedy and later with U.S. Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy. And as always, we'll hear from a skeptic who will argue Marilyn's death had nothing to do with her affairs with JFK or RFK or state secrets she scribbled down in her infamous Red Diary. Her death at the age of 36, he says, was most likely an accidental overdose. And while that may not be as sensational or exciting as a conspiracy, it's the most rational explanation based on the available facts. Me? I'm just looking for the truth, and I'm willing to follow it wherever it leads. It is time to redefine reality. Genetic enigma, a human alien hybrid.
There was at least two gunmen. One was firing from the nose.
Mainstream media technology can alter weather patterns.
Created by the corporation. The mystery, not the answer.
Engineered by the Illuminati.
There's no doubt.
Monroe's naked body is discovered face down in her bed by her housekeeper, Eunice Murray. But a number of researchers claim there are multiple problems with the official timeline of the events surrounding Monroe's death and the actual death scene itself.
Normally, when she went to sleep, she wore a bra, so the fact that she didn't have one is very suspicious. And she would have dressed up in some clothes. It's very rare, according to many medical professionals, that you find a suicide in the nude. You know, it just doesn't happen that way usually. So it's very odd that she was naked.
What else was unusual or suspicious about the death scene?
There was no water glass. Had she swallowed 47 Nebutals and 17 chlorohydrates, surely there should be something to wash it down with. You're not going to swallow it, by itself. You choke on the tablets.
I was lucky enough to speak to the first LAPD police officer on the scene, whose name was Jack Clemens. He said he got a call at 4:25 a.m. And the caller was a man who said Marilyn Monroe just committed suicide. She's dead, and he thought it was a joke. He said it just, whoever calls and says the biggest star in the world is just committed suicide and is dead.
Clemens arrives at Monroe's house, knocks on the door, and is greeted by Monroe's housekeeper, Eunice Murray.
And she said, well, around midnight. I woke up and I found her dead at midnight. And so he says, wait a minute. You found her dead at midnight, but you call me, the police, at 4:25 a.m.
Eunice Murray would later change her story several times. Finally, she claimed that she did not discover Monroe's body until closer to 3:50 a.m.
Why would you wait for 4.5 hours with a dead body in your house to call the police? She couldn't answer. He said she was stuttering and she could not answer.
However, Monroe's publicist, who was attending a concert that night at the Hollywood Bowl, received a phone call around 10 p.m. from Monroe's agent, Pat Newcomb, who was at Monroe's house at the time of her death.
It was Pat Newcomb who called Arthur and said, hey, Marilyn's in trouble. She's either dying or on the point of death, and we need you to get over here.
Several people went to Marilyn's home at that time, but they did not keep it as an official record.
So he got there at about 11 p.m.
At 10:30, we know Marilyn is dead. Yet, we don't get a call till the next day at 4:25 a.m. officially.
So it's very strange that if she was known to be dying about 10:30, why would they wait 4.5 hours to call the police? Obviously they didn't call right after she died.
There had been FBI agents who were at the house. There were CIA operatives that were placed at the house. There was more law enforcement at her house than you would expect to even see perhaps with a diplomat or an ambassador. So there was a lot of officials at her house. But again, we have the official story and we have the unofficial story. So there's a lot that went on that night.
When they investigated her body, there were no marks on her body to indicate that anybody had done anything to her. Okay, she had a huge overdose of chloral hydrate and other sleeping pills. So it was assumed, given her suicidal background, because she was always threatening suicide, by the way, that she must have actually killed herself. Most of the information at the time was covered up. We didn't know about all this other stuff that was going on.
In the coroner's office, you have an autopsy that happened by Dr. Noguchi, and next thing you know, like a day or two after it, all the body parts disappear. Every, organ, the stomach, the intestine, the kidney, the liver, the stomach contents, that was 20 cc of liquid, which is just regular mucus and hydrochloric acid in your stomach. We all have that. The autopsy report that I have with me here clearly states that the stomach is completely empty. It states no residue of the pills is noted. Now, why is that significant? The fact they found no pills or refractile crystals anywhere in the digestive system proves definitively at those high volumes not to have anything, no remnants, is almost impossible. And the reason is when the hydrochloric acid hits the pills, the Nembutal or chloral hydrate, basically what happens is that you have crystals formed. And these crystals were never found anywhere in her digestive system. And that is why that 20 cc they had disappeared overnight. So when they went to retest it to see how bizarre this is, that, she did not take what killed her orally, all the body parts had disappeared.
What do you make of the theory that she was murdered?
This is the popular theory. This is the popular mythology. Listen, I think that Marilyn Monroe was someone who had attempted suicide a number of times as an attention-seeking device. I think that she was someone who was deeply troubled. Her final movie, which never came to be, Something's Got to Give, was unfinished. She was fired from that film because of her unreliable nature. And I think that she was at a down point in her life. And I think that one attention-seeking suicide too many left her dead in the middle of the night, alone in her bedroom.
The whole thing started with her singing Happy Birthday to Jack Kennedy.
Happy birthday, Mr. President.
At that time, his wife said, "That's it. If you see this woman again, I'm leaving you." So he cut off contact with Marilyn. But Robert had had a long-term affair with her, much longer than Jack, and much more extensive.
Bobby Kennedy was present at her house at 2 p.m. with Peter Lawford on the last day of her life, trying to convince Marilyn not to go through with a press conference.
Well, the fact that Bobby Kennedy was in Los Angeles the night that Marilyn Monroe died, and at her house, is very well documented.
And when Marilyn had threatened a press conference, Bobby's reply was, "If you threaten me, Marilyn, there's more than one way to keep you quiet."
Detective Lynn Franklin, who was a Beverly Hills police officer I interviewed, he explained that he pulled over Bobby Kennedy that night and that Peter Lawford was driving.
He was there solely to get her diary so that she would not have evidence of anything to use on Monday morning, August 6th, where she had threatened to call this press conference exposing her relationships with Jack Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy.
So Bobby was spotted there by the Beverly Hills police, and then you have the FBI chief on camera that I have stating that they were following Bobby, they knew he was there. Why did he go to Los Angeles? He obviously, it was a covert operation, it was a quiet operation. He wanted to go and basically speak to Marilyn without having his voice recorded on a telephone. The only way to do it properly is you go face to face, you make sure that the house doesn't have bugs, and you talk to the individual. Now, when they talked, Bobby was so paranoid that they actually went, this is what the FBI agent told me, they actually went to the guest cottage to talk because they were afraid the main house was bugged, which it was bugged. So he definitely was at the house. There was definitely a lot that happened as far as Marilyn ended up dead.
In his book, Marilyn Monroe, A Case for Murder, author J. Margolis lays out his own alternative timeline leading to Monroe's death. Margolis believes Monroe's last phone call was to Mexican screenwriter Jose Bolaños. At approximately 9:45 p.m., Monroe heard a crash she believed came from the guest cottage on her property. Monroe told Bolaños she'd be right back, and she put the phone down. She would then discover 3 men in the guest cottage, one of whom she knew intimately.
She finds Bobby Kennedy and 2 men with him, and they throw her on the bed. They put a pillow over her face to shut her up, and then they give her a drug enema filled with 13 to 19 Nebutals and about 17 chlorohydrates to knock her out. It makes her unconscious. And then after Bobby and the 2 men do not find the red diary that they're looking for, which belonged to Monroe, they leave about 10:30, and then Mrs. Murray, the housekeeper, and her son-in-law, who was present, Norman Jeffries, said that the Kennedy and the 2 men left at 10:30.
I don't buy it. I think Robert Kennedy was a moral man. He was someone, I think, who, you know, maybe played fast and loose with some of his marital ethics. But I think beyond that, I think he was someone who was pretty by the book. And I just don't believe that he would look at a Hollywood actress who was obviously damaged, who was obviously someone who was, you know, could be dealt with in any number of ways if, in fact, there was a problem that he had to deal with her, which I don't believe. But if there was, there's 100 different ways to deal with her other than killing her. And other than, again, creating this elaborate kind of murder plot or, you know, suicide plot. It just doesn't make sense to me.
Mrs. Murray's son-in-law, Norman Jeffries, provides a timeline that Kennedy arrived at the house shortly after 9:30 p.m. and that he left at 10:30 p.m. Marilyn was perfectly fine before Kennedy went into that house, and then she's naked, unconscious, holding the phone in the guest cottage when Norman Jeffries and the housekeeper, Mrs. Murray, had returned. So Mrs. Murray did the right thing and called an ambulance. The principals involved did not anticipate that Mrs. Murray would call an ambulance, and this is where James Hall and Murray Leibowitz had arrived as ambulance attendants at Marilyn's house. All James Hall notices is Pat Newcomb screaming hysterically, leading him into the guest cottage where Marilyn is face up on the bed with no sheet and no blanket, which gives great credence to the enema theory, because why would all the sheets be removed? And so he finds a naked Marilyn. He takes her off the bed. He puts a resuscitator on her. It's doing fine. Her air is coming back. Her color and everything is returning. And they could safely take her to the hospital. But all of a sudden, Marilyn's psychiatrist, Dr. Greenson, comes in and says, remove the resuscitator. And all he identifies himself is, I am her doctor. That's what Dr. Greenson says to the ambulance attendant. He pulls out a hypodermic syringe with a heart needle already affixed to it. He fills it up with a brownish fluid, which is not adrenaline, it is Nebutal, and then he injects it directly into her heart. A couple minutes later, he says, I'm going to pronounce her dead, you can leave. He tells that to the ambulance attendant, and at that point, Marilyn is deceased.
Ralph Greenson was a lecturer at the USC Medical School, so I had met him a number of times. Very charming guy, but totally irresponsible and misbehaving. I actually knew people who knew about him. I have friends who were in the same psychoanalytic types of societies, and there were great rumors about him sleeping with Marilyn. He did a horrible job in terms of treating her. He didn't correctly diagnose her at all. And aside from whether he slept with her or not, he was the worst possible psychiatrist for her. And she was getting ready to fire him the next day, as well as the housekeeper, Eunice.
According to Peter Lawford in his last interview in 1983, Bobby had tricked Greenson. He lied to Greenson and said not only is Marilyn going to go public on Monday morning, August 6th, with the affairs of me and Jack, but Bobby told Greenson, lied to him, and said she's going to go public with your affair too with Marilyn. He did not want to be found out that he had sex with the most famous woman in the world. It would ruin his career, and it may even land him in prison, according to Peter Lawford's statement.
Marilyn was a huge problem. She loved, you know, Khrushchev and Gromyko and Russians and the Russian arts and her instructor, Michael Chekhov. And Khrushchev had personally invited Marilyn on September 19th, 1959 to go to the Moscow theater. And she had even applied for a visa. And the FBI files go on, freaking out.
Let's assume for a moment that there was a dalliance with John F. Kennedy and Marilyn Monroe. And there was pillow talk. And she took notes. And when she was spurned, she was, according to some reports, threatening to go to the press. This is happening at the height of the Cold War. The Cuban Missile Crisis was just getting underway. It's easy to see how the CIA might feel that she was posing a severe national security risk and had to be gotten rid of.
I would say to that, show me the diary. Of course, these diaries, these things that, are apparently so important to the conspiracies, of course, they always disappear. They're gone. No one ever seems to be able to find these things.
Her sympathies with the Russians really got on the nerves of the FBI and CIA, and I could understand why.
JFK and Marilyn Monroe had one one-night stand, which, from what I understand, in terms of the ex-president's sexual dalliances, is that he wasn't doing a lot of talking during these situations that he found himself in.
What's happening in 1962? In August when she died, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Right before that, in 61, you had the Bay of Pigs invasion. We unsuccessfully tried to invade Cuba. So they were after us.
First of all, I would hope that the President of the United States would be smart enough not to divulge national secrets to an unstable Hollywood actress that he happened to find himself naked with.
While all of this is happening, the tension was unbelievable. It was as intense as September 11, terrorists, Al-Qaeda.
And two, I would assume that from what I've read and what I've heard about him, that the situation didn't loan itself to, him unburdening himself of, secrets that were going to change the course of the history of the United States.
Marilyn Monroe was a major national security risk. Marilyn Monroe was a liability, a problem that had to be eliminated.
I think that the pillow talk had revealed a lot of national secrets, which were very dangerous at the time when Castro was threatening the United States with missiles.
Peter Lawford said 1 year before he died, he said, quote, "Marilyn has got to be silent," Bobby told Greenson, or words to that effect. Greenson had thus been set up by Bobby to take care of Marilyn, end quote. Now, the ambulance attendant said he saw Greenson do it with a long heart needle to the chest. So this just, gives credence to Peter Lawford's testimony.
This will never die. It will never go away. I promise you, 2,000 years from now, whether the U.S. is around or not, this will be a legendary thing everyone will talk about. Look at Cleopatra. She had an affair with Julius Caesar 2,000 years ago. 2,000 years later, we're discussing if she committed suicide or if she was murdered. This will never, ever go away, except my book and documentary does prove definitively that she was murdered and that there was a federal government cover-up and Bobby Kennedy was at the house.
Accidental overdose, suicide, murder. If Bobby Kennedy was involved in the plot to murder Marilyn Monroe to keep her quiet, I find it hard to believe that he would actually show up at Marilyn's house on the night of her death. Still, there's pretty credible evidence to suggest that he was there. But why? I think a far more plausible scenario is that some rogue element within the FBI, the CIA, or the Secret Service decided Marilyn Monroe represented a significant threat to national security, and she had to be silenced. And likely, this heinous crime was carried out after Bobby had left. The murder was then covered up by the Los Angeles Police Department and various other intelligence groups. But regardless of who killed Marilyn Monroe, why and how, the combination of her vulnerability, her naivete, and the powerful men in her life would prove to be far more lethal than any barbiturates she supposedly took that night. And now, I'd like to know what you think. Get in touch with me through the website, theconspiracyshow.com. In the meantime, don't be afraid. Welcome to The Conspiracy Show. My name is Richard Syrett. John Fitzgerald Kennedy, the 35th President of the United States, was assassinated at 12:30 p.m. Central Standard Time on Friday, November 22nd, 1963, in Daley Plaza, Dallas, Texas. The 10-month investigation of the Warren Commission of 1963-64 concluded that the president was assassinated by Lee Harvey Oswald acting alone, and that Jack Ruby acted alone when he killed Oswald before he could stand trial. These conclusions were initially supported by the American public. However, polls conducted from 1966 to 2004 found that as many as 80% of Americans have suspected there was a plot or cover-up. On this episode of The Conspiracy Show, we'll meet several prominent JFK assassination researchers who will present their best evidence for not only a cover-up of the event, but evidence for a conspiracy involving individuals at the highest levels of the U.S. government. We'll also meet a skeptic who says the best evidence supports the lone gunman single bullet theory as laid out in the Warren Commission. Me? I just want the truth, and I'm willing to follow it wherever it leads. It is time to redefine reality.
He was far more on the periphery of the conspiracy. I don't think he really realized at that point in time that he was being set up to take the fall. The elements of the fakery here, or the framing of the patsy, are simply overwhelming.
Who was Lee Harvey Oswald?
He enlisted as a young man into the Marine Corps and underwent recruit training in San Diego and at Edson Range in 1957-58, where I would later serve as a series commander and have 300 recruits and 15 drill instructors under my own command. Lee Oswald was a rather mediocre shot. During his first year when he was under most intense instruction, he fired .212. That made him a sharpshooter of the three categories: marksman, sharpshooter, and expert. But the next year, in 1958, he didn't qualify at all, which is very odd since there's a standing order that every Marine from the lowest ranking private to the highest ranking general has to qualify with a rifle every year, which suggests that he was on some special assignment. He wasn't trained to use a bolt-action rifle. The weapon that he was alleged to have used was really a very poor caliber weapon. It had a very difficult bolt action, although it was equipped with a telescopic sight. Most Americans don't realize that while that enhances accuracy, it consumes time. So at each time you would work this bolt action, it would throw you off the target, and then you'd have to reacquire your target. The whole shooting scenario was a farce.
Lee Harvey Oswald, who the Warren Commission made essentially the fall guy for the Kennedy assassination, has turned out to be one of the most complex and fascinating 24-year-olds that ever walked the face of the earth. Oswald has all the earmarks of being a kind of intelligence agent who was recruited in the Marine Corps at a relatively young age. His ostensible job was being a radar operator, but he actually ends up being tutored in Russian. By the end of his service, he literally speaks fluent Russian. Why did he become fluent in Russian? Well, he defects to Russia. There was a fake defector program going on at this time. He's obviously sent there, most people would believe, as what they call a dangle. Somebody who would be picked up by the KGB and then become some kind of double agent. But the problem is, the KGB suspected this.
Lee Harvey Oswald was a double agent for the United States intelligence agencies. He was sent to Russia to reveal secrets which would allow the U-2 spy plane to be shot down so that right-wing generals in the Pentagon could cancel the summit between Khrushchev and Eisenhower.
And again, explain Lee Harvey Oswald's role in scuttling that summit.
Lee Harvey Oswald had been trained at Atsugi, Japan, the CIA top intelligence base, in radar technology and in the U-2 overflight times. You see, the U-2, Richard, was such a fast plane and flew at such high altitudes that the Russian jets could not get up fast enough in order to catch it. So in order to shoot it down, if they had the times that the plane was going to be passing over, they could in advance get their jets up in the air, scramble them, and shoot it down, which is what they did.
In other words, you're saying that that summit may have led to the end of the Cold War.
It may have led to the end of the Cold War, certainly would have led to thawing in the relationship. 1962 was paid by the United States government to return. In volume 18 of the Warren Commission, there's what's called the Lee Harvey Oswald repatriation loan. So he is given a loan by the U.S. government. He's brought right down to Dallas, Texas, and safe housed there and protected.
He did submit an application to repatriate. It was reviewed by a committee, it was accepted by the U.S. Embassy, and you'd expect, too, that there are a couple of other factors, such as him being married, he was a U.S. citizen, and also that he had served in military. This isn't actually something that's completely out of the ordinary. That's the reason why they have these committees to begin with and why they have the application process.
Here you have this spectacle of this supposed communist revolutionary coming back to the United States and living in, of all places, with the white Russian community in Dallas. These are the people who want to overthrow Lenin's revolution and bring back the Tsar. In April of 1963, for no discernible reason, he goes to New Orleans. Now, who does he meet up with in New Orleans?
Oswald was basically working for Guy Bannister during that period. Oswald started the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. His handlers were using him to infiltrate different subversive organizations. Guy Bannister was deeply involved in the whole gun runnings to the anti-Castro Cubans. Different people he was involved with were training paramilitary groups, the whole design to overthrow Castro, which led to the Bay of Pigs.
Now, if you examine the things that Oswald did that summer, I mean, he's the only guy in the whole city who's part of this so-called Fair Play for Cuba Committee. No other members. All right? He does things like leaflet on busy streets at the rush hour in a southern city as conservative as New Orleans was at that time. You don't do this in broad daylight with hundreds of people around in a place like New Orleans.
Guy Bannister, who was a former FBI man, was in charge of the New Orleans part of making Oswald appear as if he was pro-Castro. The purpose of the assassination was to raise the anger of Americans to such a degree that they would agree and be in favor of launching an attack on Cuba. And by giving out Fair Play for Cuba pamphlets, they were trying to build this case to make it appear as if Oswald was a Lenin Marxist and was pro-Cuba, so that they could blame the assassination on Castro.
Jim Garrison, who's an author, he's a former New Orleans district attorney, has written extensively about this and suggests that because the offices, and particularly the pamphlet that indicates that office, were so close together that there was some sort of linkage between Oswald and Bannister.
The side door was the CIA headquarters, and the other address was the Fair Play for Cuba.
These pieces of evidence were investigated by the Warren Commission. So Sam Newman, who owned the property at the time and had rented to Bannister, testified to the committee that he'd never seen Oswald before. None of the other tenants had seen Oswald before. There was a Cuban revolutionary group that met on the First Fork Cafe at a bar called, I think, Mercuso's. So Mercuso's may have been a meeting spot. However, Mercuso himself, the owner of the cafe, was also interviewed by the committee and swore never to have seen Oswald before in his life either.
Mannlicher Carcano, it was basically a piece of junk that, that they claimed that were able to fire allegedly 3 shots in a matter of a few seconds, which was physically impossible.
The Mannlicher Carcano really was in terrible shape. It hadn't been properly maintained. As I mentioned, it had this very difficult bolt action. And Lee Oswald was never trained in the Marine Corps to use a bolt action weapon. He was never used to fire with a telescopic sight. He was never trained to fire from a tall building. This particular weapon had a rusty firing pin. The weapon in general had the coy practice of blowing the firing pin out in the face of the shooter. The scope was misaligned, and the professional marksmen were asked to attempt to replicate Lee Oswald's shots, none of which were successful in doing so. So it was really a bona fide piece of junk.
I find the fact that this is sometimes called the humanitarian rifle, and that it's disparaged for some of its characteristics, because many of the exact same characteristics that you'd point out in this rifle are very consistent with it being used in exactly this type of scenario. This particular model, for starters, was the standard infantry unit for Italian infantry for half a century, including both world wars.
The first shot that you see on the Zapruder film when he was hit in the throat was not possible because there was what's called a Texas elm was in the way. So there wasn't a clear shot at that point.
One of the characteristics of these Italian rifles is that they have a much smaller bore cartridge. By having a smaller bore cartridge, you actually get a tighter plane of angle, a lot less shake in the movement, a lot less recoil, a lot less stopping power. It's not a surprise at all that he was able to accomplish 3 very quick shots.
Why would someone intent on killing the president order the weapon used through the mail and then pose for a photograph?
Yeah, this is a good point, of course. Why wouldn't he just go into a local store and buy it and pay cash so that it's not traceable? Well, the answer is obvious. The people who were behind the assassination wanted to set Oswald up as a patsy, and so in order to do that, they ordered it through the mail so that it could be traced.
If you examine a transaction, the Warren Commission says was a transaction which secured Oswald ordering the rifle. You have to believe that Oswald left his job at Jagger Child Stovall in the morning, even though there's record to say he didn't leave the job at all that day. He then went ahead and purchased a money order, allegedly for this rifle. But he didn't mail the money order from the post office. He walked something like 3 miles out of his way to deposit it in a mailbox, all right? All right. He then went ahead and walked back to work, and nobody ever missed him. Now, let's pick up the trail of this so-called money order. You have to believe the post office picked it up from the mailbox, drove it back to the mail center, sorted all the mail out, put it on a plane, flew it into Chicago, then the mail was transferred to the mail center there, that it was all sorted out at the big mail center in Chicago, that it was then distributed to the proper mail carrier. He went ahead and drove it to the postal office in that area. It was then sorted out again to the actual guy going ahead and delivering the mail, dropped it off at Klein's. This is supposed to be the arms center that Oswald ordered the rifle from. They went ahead, because they sorted out their mail also by checks, money orders, cash, etc. Klein's went ahead and gave it to their courier, and their courier then went ahead over to the bank and deposit it at the bank. Now, if I asked any rational person, how long do you think that transaction took? I think they would probably say 4 days, maybe. Because if you look the way the post office does it now, it's all by zip code and sensors. They put it on a big conveyor belt, okay, and the sensor records it, sorts it out, etc. This is all done by hand. The Warren Commission wants you to believe that that entire transaction that I just described took 24 hours. I'm sorry, I don't believe it. You can't do that today with zip codes and all these other, computer things we have. So how could it possibly happen in 1963? Arlen Specter, at that time, a DA in Philadelphia, he put together this single bullet theory, sometimes referred to as the magic bullet, in which he says that Oswald firing a shot from the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository, this one bullet went through Kennedy, through Conley, ended up lodged in Conley's upper thigh, and then was discovered at Parkland Hospital after it slipped out from his thigh onto a gurney.
Did the wounds on JFK's body match the official story in terms of the trajectory of the shots fired from the 6th floor?
You have a young Arlen Specter holding a pointer showing the trajectory that the magic bullet would have had to have taken if the magic bullet hypothesis were true. And when you look down below his hand several inches, you see this big patch on the back of the stand-in, which means that a photograph that was intended to illustrate the magic bullet theory actually refutes it.
This exhibit, of course, is called CE399. The problem with CE399 is that every step of the way, it falls flat on its face. And I'm not talking about just the trajectory or the fact that it didn't have any blood in it, it didn't have any tissue on it, that none of the Secret Service agents who said they saw it, none of their initials are on it.
Many JFK researchers have trouble with the magic bullet theory, particularly it's reported with the timing, that they believe that there was an initial theory that was developed incorporating all 3 shots, and that this was then changed when it was found out that one of the shots missed the president by a very wide margin. We would expect that when new evidence comes out that the story has to change.
I don't think Oswald was involved in whatever happened in Dealey Plaza. In fact, I believe you can make a very good case that Oswald might have been the informant that blew the whistle on the Chicago plot. 3 weeks before, there was a plot to kill Kennedy in Chicago. What's so amazing about the plot in Chicago is that it's very similar to the plot in Dallas. Kennedy was supposed to be in a motorcade, getting off a freeway, getting in front of I think a 4-story building, okay? And there were supposed to be assassins waiting right near the building, and they already had picked out the patsy, Thomas Valet, who had the same profile as Oswald. The informant who started the ball rolling to roll up the Chicago plot, his code name was Lee. So I think you can make a case that Oswald might have heard about this, and he might have been the guy that called in to the FBI, because I believe he was an FBI informant, and blew the whistle on the Chicago plot, and therefore that was foiled. But then it did succeed in Dallas. So if you ask me, I don't think Oswald had anything to do with what happened in Dallas.
Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
There have been 2 official investigations. The Warren Commission concluded Oswald acted alone. The other, the House Select Committee on Assassinations, concluded that there was a conspiracy. Many of the key documents which could tell the whole story remain classified. John F. Kennedy's brain is still missing from the National Archives. The Secret Service removed and replaced the windshield of Kennedy's limousine so that they could allegedly cover up the fact that it had a bullet hole coming from the grassy knoll in front of the limo. Numerous witnesses were badgered and threatened to keep silent, especially the numerous ones who knew about the shots from the grassy knoll. Over 20 witnesses who would not change their stories supposedly met with mysterious deaths. When the real body of JFK arrived at Bethesda Naval Hospital for autopsy, it came in a gray military coffin, zipped in a body bag. 2 FBI agents in the room took detailed notes and described the autopsy physician, exclaiming that this body had already been dissected. In fact, the top of the head came off on the table, and the brain apparently had been removed. The report made by these 2 agents was suppressed, supposedly, by J. Edgar Hoover. All Navy personnel present were threatened with dire consequences if they mentioned anything they saw. Some eventually spoke out about what happened when Congress held the second Kennedy investigation. The autopsy physician at Bethesda admitted to burning his initial report and rewriting one that he had been instructed to write, conforming to the altered body. Photographs of the autopsy were locked up, and the Warren Commission only allowed artist sketches to be presented. When the real photo surfaced years later, it was evident the artist had been instructed to alter the appearance of the photos, researchers say. Why the secrecy, if Oswald was just a crazed lone gunman? And now, I'd like to know what you think. You can contact me here at The Conspiracy Show through our website, www.theconspiracyshow.com. In the meantime, don't be afraid. Welcome to The Conspiracy Show. My name is Richard Syrett. On August 16, 1977, the undisputed king of rock and roll passed from this earth, found face down in the shag carpeting in the bathroom of his Graceland mansion in Memphis, Tennessee. Almost from the moment news of his supposed death hit the news media, there were those who doubted that he was really dead. Wishful thinking? Simple denial? Tonight, The Conspiracy Show investigates claims and examines new evidence that Elvis not only faked his death, but that he is alive to this day, living in complete anonymity in a secret location. First, a prominent rock and roll investigator lays out the whole Elvis is alive legend. And then we'll hear from a member of the Elvis Underground who claims to have first-hand knowledge that the king is still with us. We'll also meet a retired member of the LA Sheriff's Department who has been investigating reports that Elvis is alive since 1977. And of course, we'll get a skeptical perspective from researchers who remain convinced Elvis has left the building. Me? I'm just like you. I want the truth, and I'm willing to follow the truth wherever it leads. Friends, it is time to redefine reality. Genetic enigma or a human alien hybrid?
There was at least 2 gunmen. One was firing from the nose.
Is it possible technology can alter weather patterns?
Created by the
Has been engineered by the Illuminati?
There's no doubt.
This is the famous RCA Victor recording studio here in Nashville. After Elvis's initial recordings with Sun Records, his contract was purchased by RCA, and of course he made some of his most famous recordings right here in this building. I guess the question is, if Elvis faked his death and is still alive today, does he occasionally still show up here to lay down a few tracks?
2 weeks before August 16th, Elvis canceled his tour, fired half his entourage. 2 weeks later, of course, August 16th, was when the shenanigans began.
Paul, why are you so convinced that Elvis didn't die August 16th, 1977?
Because the bank account statement showed the checks, $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 checks to people, and the checks were written at Elvis's bank and signed by Elvis. And that morning, around 9:30, a courier delivered a package that Elvis signed. That piece of paper is still in existence. It just doesn't add up. There's no way possible you can be sitting on the toilet, signing checks, answering the door, and everything else.
I remain a skeptic myself. However, I can't ignore some of the things that came up that I can't explain. Right after his death, I had another deputy show me some photos, supposedly of Elvis getting into a helicopter with some suited guys with dark glasses, and he told me this was taken supposedly several hours after Elvis was allegedly dead.
You know, that's the mysterious black helicopters, and they were flying over Graceland. A conspiracy idea that he was lifted out and maybe a body was taken and put in place. And one of the great rumors was that Elvis weighed over 250 pounds when he died, but on the autopsy report, the weight said 170. So the idea of the missing body being exchanged. But, you know, I think that's where the black helicopter comes in, but all great conspiracy theories have black helicopters, right?
Yes, there was a man that fit his exact description that left in a helicopter from the back of Graceland.
Someone who looked like Elvis? Well, I don't know if you've looked at photos from the other people that were living in that house, but a lot of people kind of looked like Elvis who were living in that house, especially if you saw them from a distance. Elvis is someone who traveled by a private jet. He would take helicopters around. There was probably a fairly common occurrence to see a helicopter land at Graceland, even maybe so the day before or the day of his death.
I recall the story, and this sets up one of the great clues of the wax dummy in the coffin. And a lot of people would look at the body and they'd say, no, that's not Elvis. It looks like a dummy. It looks like it's made out of wax.
The body in the casket. looked somewhat waxen.
Right.
And one mentioned that he had a pug nose. Elvis didn't have a pug nose. His hands were too smooth, but they would have been calloused because he was into the martial arts.
Right.
The other thing about it, that a sideburn had fallen off and had to be glued back.
One mentioned beads of sweat or condensation.
Somewhere between 200 and 300 people that reported sweat beads.
They actually saw beads of perspiration.
All adding up to the possibility that the body was in fact made of wax.
The Elvis that was in that coffin was a thin-looking 1950s Elvis.
The reason the coffin was so heavy is there's an air conditioner that was placed in the bottom of the coffin to help keep the wax dummy cool so that it wouldn't melt.
It was about a 900-pound casket. That makes perfect sense.
And weren't there 8 or 12?
There was 12
pallbearers, yeah.
If it was, in fact, a wax Elvis that was inside this coffin, which I don't believe, by the way, but if it was, maybe to avoid what happened to Charlie Chaplin when people dug up the body and tried to make off with it, or maybe people were just sort of imagining things. I mean, there is talk that the pug nose came from Elvis when he died. He fell over, and the idea is that he fell, literally, did a face plant into the floor. Some people saw pudgy hands, others didn't. Some people said that he was thin, others said that he had gained 50 pounds. It just sort of gives a shroud of confusion that seems to hang over this whole thing.
Elvis was born in Tupelo, Mississippi. He lived in Memphis, but when it came time to make music, he came here, Music City, USA, Nashville. We're going to discuss whether or not it's possible Elvis Aaron Presley did not, in fact, leave the building.
Talk to me about the controversy surrounding the casket. No U.S. flag. The significance of that.
Elvis was a veteran, and when Elvis died, a lot of people thought it was odd that Vernon did not have an American flag draped over Elvis's coffin because he did make it to the rank of sergeant. But I'm not too sure how Vernon felt about the government taking Elvis into the Army and drafting him, because he felt like Elvis was really doing a lot for the United States government money-wise, and now they sort of betrayed him and took him into the Army. Vernon was never a fan of Elvis being in the Army, and they didn't have taps played or they didn't have the gun salute.
Well, when I spoke to the gentleman who worked at the Memphis Funeral Home at the time, and he said that while a lot of people put flags on their casket, that was never mentioned to Vernon, and it was not offered nor was it asked for. They had told the funeral home, please handle the arrangements. And Vernon, in his condition, was not going to be consulting with them. So they were given pretty much a blank check, do what you think is appropriate, and that's what they did. So where the claim came from that Vernon was asked that about the flag and that he refused the flag, I don't know. But the gentleman who worked for the funeral home says that that did not happen.
Elvis was superstitious and he wanted to fake death. So if he's going to fake it, he's not going to give death a chance to come and get him. So you would say, well, I would have a flag on my funeral. Well, since I'm not really dead, let's just put roses. So when I do die, I can do the funeral the way it should be. And that, hence the spelling on the tombstone, everything else.
Of course, if you weren't really dead, you wouldn't want your actual full, correctly spelled name on a tombstone. I mean, who would, right?
The apparent misspelling of Elvis's middle name, Aaron, on the tombstones, which is significant because when Elvis was born, and it was misspelled, spelled with 2 A's on his birth certificate, apparently Vernon went to great lengths to get that corrected on his birth certificate, and yet on the tombstone it was spelled with 2 A's.
After 1965 or 1966, he had wanted to go to the state of Mississippi and have his name changed. When he found out that it was already changed to the AA, they left it at that, but his father knew that he wanted to make that change. So to say that Vernon misspelled it is not accurate. He knew that Elvis wanted the AA spelling, and that's why it's on the gravestone.
If Elvis faked his death, what would some of the reasons, what might have been some of the motives for doing that?
Okay. Why Elvis would fake his death, the first reason was he was too famous. He had to rent whole movie theaters out after midnight so he could bring his friends in and they could watch film. Or when he took his daughter out for her birthday, he had to rent the entire amusement park, close it out, and use it. So that here he was, a prisoner of his own fame at Graceland. That was one. The second one was that Elvis, when he met Richard Nixon and got his special badge for the drug enforcement, that he had turned in some huge drug ring involving the mafia, and that they were taking a contract out on his life. So Elvis was put into witness protection.
Much has been made that he was a federal agent, that Richard Nixon made him a federal agent. Well, that simply never happened. Elvis, who knows in what state of mind, contacted Nixon and said, listen, I've got contacts all over the music industry. I can help you. I could root out the evil that is drugs. Meanwhile, his clothes are literally rattling with little jars of pills that he has tucked away in all his pockets. And because he's Elvis Presley, he gets to meet the president. Because he's Elvis Presley, he gets more than just a set of cufflinks that all the other VIPs get. Because he's Elvis Presley, he got a badge. And he got a badge that made him something like a special enforcer for the, which was, it doesn't mean there's no such position.
Elvis had apparently taken part in an FBI sting called Project Fountain Pen, which sent some mobsters to jail because one of Elvis's jets, I believe, had been leased by these mobsters.
Vernon was a horrible money manager, and it was the mob that basically extorted money out of Elvis and Vernon, and they got in a plane. And eventually, Frederick Peter Pro, along with the rest of his cronies, were busted and served their time.
Regarding Operation Fountain Pen, that was an FBI investigation that was actually quite broad. It didn't focus on Elvis. Elvis was just a part of it. What a lot of people don't know about this, and I spoke to the gentleman who put Operation Fountain Pen together and was actually working undercover on the case on Elvis's part of it, is that Elvis didn't know about Operation Fountain Pen. Vernon didn't know about Operation Fountain Pen.
He was never actually a federal agent, which very likely means he was never involved in an FBI operation to take down anybody.
The Lloyds of London life insurance policy that went uncashed after his death, apparently it's not illegal to fake your death, but it is illegal to profit from it. Therefore, the life insurance policy could not be cashed because that would be fraud.
Right. If, in fact, they'd ever taken out a life insurance policy with Lloyds of London.
I have seen the actual documentation that there is still an active life insurance policy for Elvis Presley.
You got to understand, I worked major frauds as a detective, so I'm used to looking at paper trails and understanding why, trying to reason why people would do things. So I'm thinking about this, and I'm thinking, okay, let's go on the theory. Let's say he faked his death. If you call a life insurance policy, that's fraud if you didn't really die.
So that's why that was never touched. But other insurance policies, bank accounts, and everything was drained.
You would think that there would be some life insurance. He was a huge star. But Elvis in his business dealings, they weren't, he wasn't a very good businessman, and he wasn't being handled by people who were particularly good business people either. So it wouldn't surprise me at all if a lot of those sort of details just simply weren't looked after.
A month or so prior to that, Elvis took a loan out on Graceland. Why he would do that when
he was about to go on tour?
Yeah, about to go on tour, then cancels the tour, then writes checks in excess of $20,000 plus to doctors, close friends, and
paying
stuff
people off, perhaps?
Yeah, basically, possibly paying people off.
I think one of the best things that came up was that I got an anonymous tip that Elvis Presley's credit history was showing up, that someone was searching his credit history for a loan. And the credit history is being run under the name of John Burroughs. John Burroughs was an AKA that Elvis often used when he checked into hotels, so that people wouldn't know that Elvis Presley was there.
Joe Esposito has admitted to him.
Yeah, Joe.
He's probably going to get very mad over this, but Joe Esposito has admitted to Paul on the phone, on speaker, so I heard it, but he said quite bluntly that Elvis did not die that day. But if you ever tell anybody that, I'll just say you're crazy.
If you were to discover Elvis's whereabouts, found out that he was alive and living under a witness relocation program,
would you ever reveal that information?
No. Nor would I even want to. Why would I put somebody's life in jeopardy to prove someone's conspiracy theory when he's not doing anything but just what he agreed to? No, I would never do that.
Well, so long. Oh, how I hate to see you go. Well, so long, baby.
What about the supposed tape recordings, audio recordings of Elvis Presley made after 1977? What can you tell me about that?
I've got one that's been voice printed as Elvis, the Silver Nora album, with the Do You Know Who I Am, Loving You, I Love Her Any Night, and so on and so forth, have been voice printed, and they are exact match to Elvis's voice.
I don't know if you've ever been to Collingwood, Ontario for Elvis Week, but there's a lot of people who look and sound like Elvis there. I don't know. I don't buy it. I think that, you know, they are elaborate hoaxes. I think that, you know, in some ways it's a bit of fun.
It is a house that, from all outside appearances, not much bigger than this house.
Yeah, it's basically ghetto. From what I saw, it looked like Elvis.
Tell me about this address, 2901 Columbus Avenue in Fort Worth.
It is a house that, from all outside appearances, not much bigger than this house.
Yeah, it's basically ghetto. We got it outside and back, and you can see the full silhouette of a man. He was kind of heavy set. From what I saw, it looked like Elvis.
You're saying that 2901 Columbus Avenue in Fort Worth, Texas is where Elvis Presley is currently residing?
At least that's what the credit report shows. The last known credit transaction was done at that address. Multiple credit transactions. And the prior address to that was 3977 Elvis Presley Boulevard.
Graceland.
What's some of the other mythology out there that suggests that Elvis might be alive that we haven't covered so far?
Personal sightings. I remember a time when someone saw him in Kalamazoo, Michigan. Elvis is in Kalamazoo. People come up, I saw this guy, he fixed my car. I had a flat tire, and I looked at it, and it was Elvis, and he changed my tire for me. Or I was in a bar, and this guy gets up on stage, and he was a fabulous singer, and he looked just like Elvis, but his hair was gray, so Elvis is alive.
You know, in some ways, when someone like this passes away, when Michael Jackson goes, when Kurt Cobain went, you know, even to a lesser extent, Jimi Hendrix and people like that, people want to believe something else. You know, Elvis really changed things on the landscape, not only musically, but sort of as a pop culture figure, and he was taken rather suddenly and unexpectedly, and of course that leads to conspiracy theories and people wanting him to be alive. But the only thing that I object to are people who are disingenuous about it, people who say, well, no, Elvis calls me, or this is a new Elvis record, and suck in the fans who really want to believe it, who want to believe it's true.
Is there any late-breaking evidence that you've received to suggest that Elvis may in fact still be alive?
As much as I would love to accommodate you with some things that I have learned here just recently in the last year or so, I can't, but I will tell you this. I'll make you this promise. When the time comes that I know for sure what this information, where it leads, your show will be the only show that I'll reveal that information. How's that?
For me, many of the questions raised by the Presley Commission have been resolved. The misspelling of Elvis's middle name, Aaron, on his gravestone, the supposed uncashed life insurance policy, and the missing U.S. flag on his casket, all have reasonable explanations. And the theory that a wax dummy was placed in the casket to fool mourners is interesting. But of the thousands of people who filed past Elvis's body, only 2 commented that it didn't look like Elvis. And what about Elvis's motive for faking his death? That he feared for his life if he testified against several mobsters in an FBI sting called Project Fountain Pen. Our skeptic has pretty much dismantled that. The recordings, supposedly made by Elvis post-1977, well, most of us now know they were performed by the late Elvis impersonator Jimmy Ellis. The picture of Muhammad Ali posing outside a New York hospital with Jesse Jackson and someone who admittedly looks like Elvis, well, we now know that individual was a man named Larry Kolb, who worked as Ali's bodyguard. What's left are countless supposed Elvis sightings around the United States. The sad truth is that in any crowd of, say, 1,000 people, you could probably find someone with a resemblance to Elvis. Finally, If Elvis faked his death in 1977 and truly wanted to remain out of the public eye, would he be posing for newspaper photos with Muhammad Ali? Would he be recording music and releasing it on the internet? Not likely. I've been following this story for years, and I have to admit, for a time I thought there was a chance Elvis might still be alive. But now, in the absence of any convincing evidence, I am finally ready to admit the king is gone. Long live the king. And now, I'd like to know what you think. You can contact us here at The Conspiracy Show through our website, www.theconspiracyshow.com. In the meantime, don't be afraid.